In 1945, Europe was a graveyard. Cities lay in ashes, borders blurred, and the smoke of a 6-year cataclysm still hung in the air. But amid the ruins of the old world, new powers were already moving, quietly, strategically, and in the shadows. The Soviet Union was expanding westward, its armies entrenched in half of Europe. To many in Washington and in Rome, it felt as though the war had ended only to give birth to a different one. A war without fronts, without declarations, and without rules. This was the moment that gave birth to Operation Gladio. Gladio was the code name for a network that was never supposed to exist. A covert army buried inside the heart of Western Europe, armed, funded, and trained to fight a war that might never come. Officially, it was a stay-behind organization, a defensive measure to resist a Soviet invasion. Unofficially, it was something else entirely, a machine built on secrecy, ideology, and fear. The alliance that sustained it was as unlikely as it was powerful. On one side stood the Central Intelligence Agency, the young and ambitious arm of American power, forged in the wake of World War II. On the other stood the Vatican, ancient, influential, and terrified of a world where atheist communism might erase centuries of faith. Between them lay a shared fear and a shared opportunity. From the Vatican's point of view, communism was not just a political threat, it was a spiritual plague. Churches had been burned in the East, priests imprisoned, faith outlawed. To the Holy See, the Soviets were the antithesis of God's order on earth. In America's eyes, the USSR was a geopolitical monster that had to be contained at any cost. Together, the two powers would find common cause. Not through treaties or public alliances, but through whispers, money transfers, and the creation of a secret army. The arrangement was never signed, never recorded. It existed in letters that vanished, in meetings without minutes, and in handshakes made in rooms lit by candle flame and secrecy. The CIA would supply the funds, weapons, and training. The Vatican would supply the moral justification, and a web of influence that reached every village and every confessional booth in Catholic Europe. At the center of it all was money, and money needed a channel. The Vatican Bank, the Institute for Religious Works, became a quiet conduit for funds that were meant for salvation, but sometimes bought guns instead. Donations to anti-communist causes flowed in from the faithful and were redirected into projects that no parish bulletin would ever announce. Through these channels, millions moved across borders, untraceable, tax-free, and wholly on paper. And so Gladio was born, not in a military barracks, but in a network of belief and fear. Recruits were drawn from the remnants of Europe's wartime armies, men who hated communism as much as they feared irrelevance. Former fascists, soldiers, and partisans were silently re-enlisted. They were told they were patriots, guardians of Europe's future. Few ever knew whose orders they were truly following. In Italy, the operation found fertile ground. The country was deeply Catholic, politically fragile, and home to the largest communist party in Western Europe. If the Reds ever won elections there, Washington feared the dominoes would fall one by one across the continent. And so, in the shadows of the Vatican Dome, a silent partnership was forged between priests who blessed the mission and agents who funded it. By the early 1950s, secret arms caches were buried across Italy, France, Belgium, and West Germany. Explosives, machine guns, radio equipment, all waiting for a war that might never be fought openly. Training camps operated under the guise of youth organizations and private clubs. Each country had its own code name, its own cell, and its own cover story. Only a handful of men at the top knew the entire map. They called themselves the stay-behind forces. But over time, staying behind wasn't enough. Some wanted to take the fight to their own streets, to eradicate communism not just in theory but in practice. And when those ambitions mixed with money, politics, and religious zeal, Gladio's mission began to shift from defense to something darker. The first whispers of the strategy of tension would soon emerge. A belief that fear itself could be a weapon, that terror could steer public opinion and preserve the old order. But for now, in the early years after the war, the network was still building, its roots deepening in the soil of a divided Europe, watered by money, secrecy, and faith. Few in the Vatican spoke of it openly, But the sentiment was clear. If the church could help save souls from communism, perhaps a little silence was a small price to pay. And in Langley, Virginia, the CIA saw in this holy discretion the perfect cover for a global operation. Together, they had found something rare, a mutual interest wrapped in mutual secrecy. As Europe rebuilt its churches and cities, another Europe was being built beneath it, a shadow Europe, armed and waiting, ready to move at a moment's notice. History would remember the Marshall Plan, the Treaty of Rome, and the birth of the European Union. It would not remember the hidden hand that helped shape them. Not until decades later, when the truth began to leak through the cracks of time. Because what began as a secret army to fight communism would soon be accused of fighting democracy itself. Officially, the plan was simple. If the Soviet army ever crossed into Western Europe, Gladio's networks would strike from behind enemy lines, sabotage, assassinate, disrupt. They would become Europe's ghost army, rising from its ashes to defend its freedom. It sounded noble, it sounded necessary, but even noble plans rot when left too long in the dark. The CIA oversaw coordination through NATO's clandestine committees, secret branches so deeply buried that even generals weren't told they existed. American officers trained European recruits in guerrilla tactics, explosives, and psychological warfare. Instructors came from the OSS, from special forces, and sometimes from the unlikeliest places, men whose pasts were too dark to speak of. Many had fought for the wrong side in the last war, but now they were being repurposed for a new one. In Italy, Gladio found its strongest base. Its headquarters hid within layers of bureaucracy, disguised as civil defense programs or patriotic associations. Weapons caches were buried in forests, under barns, and even inside church property. Some priests, without knowing the full scope, allowed safe storage for the resistance, a patriotic gesture that in truth armed a secret army no one officially controlled. Money flowed through curious channels. American intelligence funds were laundered through front organizations, through banks friendly to the church, and through the Vatican's own network of charitable accounts. To the outside world, these were donations for anti-communist education or refugee support. In reality, they kept Gladio's operatives fed, trained, and invisible. But a network built on secrecy soon becomes a world without oversight. And when the lines between defense and manipulation blurred, the mission changed. What had been created to defend democracy began to operate outside it. By the late 1950s, Western Europe was stable. There was no invasion. Yet Gladio's funding grew, its structure hardened, its influence deepened. Without an external enemy on their doorstep, some within the network began to search for internal ones. In their minds, the real threat was not Soviet tanks, but ideas. The rise of left-wing parties, labor movements, and intellectuals sympathetic to socialism. To stop them, fear would need to be resurrected. In this new phase, Gladio's function expanded beyond military readiness. It became a psychological operation, a hidden lever within democratic societies. If the population could be frightened into seeing the left as chaos, then the right would always seem like safety. It was a simple equation. Control through fear. The Vatican, meanwhile, continued to play its quiet part. Its newspapers and pulpits echoed warnings about godless communism infiltrating society. Cardinals spoke of moral decay, of youth movements drifting from faith. The church's message aligned perfectly with Washington's agenda. Different motives, same enemy. To many within the clergy, Gladio's shadow was invisible. To a few, it was divine insurance. In Italy, the operation deepened its political connections. Some members of the ruling Christian Democratic Party had direct links to Gladio's organizers. They saw the network not only as protection against Moscow, but as protection against domestic change. If elections ever threatened to swing left, the fear machine could be switched on, quietly, effectively. Across Europe, similar cells mirrored Italy's pattern. In Belgium, France, and Germany, caches of weapons and explosives were hidden beneath farms and warehouses. In Turkey, the counter-guerrilla was formed, a local Gladio variant that would later be accused of torture and assassinations. Everywhere the pattern repeated. Noble beginnings, murky ends. The CIA continued to provide training, while MI6 offered logistical advice. But the operations themselves were left to the locals, men loyal to their nations, or to something darker. Each country's Gladio unit answered to its own intelligence service, but in practice, they all served the same master, the logic of the Cold War. And as the years passed, that logic demanded results. The East was not invading, but Western fear had to be kept alive. If peace looked too secure, budgets would shrink, attention would fade, and the machinery of secrecy would rust. So new methods were quietly discussed, methods to remind citizens that danger was everywhere. Within certain Gladio circles, a new doctrine emerged, the strategia della tensione, the strategy of tension. Its premise was chillingly simple. Create small acts of chaos, blame them on the left, and watch the public turn toward order. Fear, not tanks, would preserve the status quo. This strategy was never written down, never confessed, but its fingerprints began to appear in the decades that followed. Bombings without clear motive, assassinations of union leaders, kidnappings of activists, crimes that sowed confusion but somehow always benefited the same side. Investigations would later hint that these acts were not the work of lone extremists, but of trained men with invisible backing. And as the 1960s dawned, the Cold War entered its most psychological phase. Propaganda, religion, and covert operations blended into a single battlefield for the human mind. The CIA had its agents, the Vatican had its missionaries, and Gladio had its ghosts. By now, few remembered the original promise of defense. The network had grown beyond its creators, feeding on secrecy itself. It was a self-sustaining organism, too useful to destroy and too dangerous to expose. And it was about to enter the bloodiest chapter of its history, a chapter that would shake Italy to its core and leave the world wondering who truly ruled from the shadows.